In Anti-Authoritarian Youth Culture in Francoist Spain, Luis Dean Valencia Garcia writes that the regime of Francisco Franco, who ruled from 1936 until 1975, promoted an exceptionalist image of Spain as different from other European countries, seen in an extended Francoist campaign that attempted to create an image of an exotic Spain to attract foreign tourists. Description of this exotic Spain onto the Spanish mentalite also attempted to legitimate Francoism through an explanation that posited a particular Spanish need for an authoritarian regime because of its difference to other European countries.
Now buckle in. We're tackling the idea of Convivencia, and we're going to do it like Charlie Kelly watched a bunch of Lindsay Ellis videos and then shotgunned 6 Red Bulls. So let's get into it. There's this prevailing notion in medieval Iberian history that Spain is somehow exceptional for having a multicultural, multi-religious society. Originating from Americo Castro in 1948, the idea of convivencia arose as a way to understand tolerance for Jewish and Christian communities under Islamic rule. And while adversely affected by the Christian reconquest of the peninsula, convivencia posits that this sense of harmony would maintain until Isabel the Catholic's expulsion of the Jews in 1492 and of the Muslims in 1502. A rival school of thought, aptly named anti-convivencia, was championed by Claudio Sanchez Albornoz and took on a more positivism perspective, arguing that there was a sense of Christian Spanish identity and culture long before the Arab invasion, and that following the Christian reconquest, Muslims and Jews contributed very little to the construction of Spanish statehood or identity. In more modern historical scholarship, despite most historians understanding that the convivencia-anti-convivencia debate is limited, fall into similar traps, painting medieval Spain and medieval Iberia more broadly as either a totally tolerant space where everyone got along all the time, or a vicious hellscape that thrived on violence. And both of these perspectives are limited. Castro approached a small section of medieval Spanish history from a philosophical, literary perspective that neglected to really address the political and religious oppression in Christian Spain.
For instance, the Siete Partidas from Alfonso X, which were still active in the 14th century and punished any Christian that converted to Islam and any Muslim that had sex with a non-Muslim. It also stipulated that Muslims were not allowed to have mosques in town and, called Islam an insult to God. This isn't even mentioning later period anti-Muslim rhetoric or the astronomical amount of anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish violence in the period.
And Sanchez Albornoz neglected to address a lot of cultural and social interactions between Muslims, Jews, and Christians that are filled with camaraderie and tolerance.
As seen here with a leaf from the Libro de Ajedrez, Dados y Tablas, commissioned in 1283 by Alfonso X, and in the appointment of the Jewish treasurer Samuel ben Mir Halevi Aguafila in the Castilian court.
So, if we're not going to understand Spain through convivencia, then how are we going to understand it? The art of 14th century Spain is often characterized by what D. Fairchild Ruggles calls cultural hybridity, but more aptly falls into categories of either appropriation or acculturation. In many ways, the stylistic blurring we see between Spanish architecture is just as much a product of sustained contact between Christian and Muslim people as it is a demonstration of power. So, we're going to begin and end with some historical musings, and then address 2 royal architectural constructions to show cultural and artistic variation. But first, history. Pedro I de Castile, also known sometimes as Pedro the Cruel and also sometimes as Pedro the Just, ruled Castile from age 16 in 1350 to about age 35 in 1369. Among other things, he warred with another Pedro in Aragon, was usurped by his half-brother Henry, and liked having sex with women. A lot. A lot of art historians, Dodds, have classified Pedro's relative tolerance to the taxation of the Jews, as well as his appointment of Samuel ben Mir Halevi Agualafia to the higher offices of his court, as an indication of widespread convivencia. Others still, Nuremberg, have argued that the still going strong Siete Partidas from Alfonso X el Sabio, as well as, the anti-Jewish violence from the Black Death, indicated widespread anti-convivencia. Historically, the period is difficult to define. Like any historical period and like any complex multicultural society, it's reductive to try and apply a single term to it. We shall be covering more history at the end, but for now, this shall have to do. Until then, let us turn to the seat of royalty. Shortly after coming to power, Pedro redecorated the royal palace at Tordesillas, previously belonging to Alfonso XI, in the Nasrid architectural style, namely with slender columns, colorful geometric tilework, horseshoe arches, carved plaster walls with lace-like patterns and Arabic inscriptions, extensive use of the murcarnas, and four-part gardens. First, as always, some historical context so that we can really appreciate the Palacio in all of its glory. Pedro was involved in the Aragon-Castile War because of his previous ally. The aforementioned other Pedro offered protections to some guy our Pedro didn't like. And then our Pedro pissed off the other Pedro because our Pedro elevated the other Pedro's exiled half-brother to an honored position in the Castilian court. So basically, Pedro decided to do a war for a couple of really petty reasons and also because territory. Yay!
Pedro de Castile allied himself with Muhammad V, Caliph King of Granada. Muhammad helped Pedro win his war, later on Pedro helped Muhammad when his half-brother Ismail deposed him, and on the whole their alliance was strong and steady. So much so that Pedro incorporated aspects of Islamic architectural stylization into his own Christian palace. The Palacio de Tordesillas, a palace that Pedro used as his royal residence for a time until he moved to the Alcazar, is filled with Islamic influences. There are interlacing arches, which, to make this weird architectural construction brief and simple, was a style of polylobed arch where the lower arch is broken into several smaller arches with an upper arch overlapping and creating a cool optical illusion effect. And these interlacing polylobed arches were Islamic in invention, with Caliph al-Hakam II creating the first of them for the Grand Mosque of Cordoba.
Let's dig a little deeper though. In the palace proper, there are these Pseudo-Arabic inscriptions, despite Pedro being deeply Christian and deeply Spanish, not Muslim and not Arabic. So, okay, it's not actually Arabic, at least some sources say some of it isn't, because it's similar in the sense that there are swirls and edges where you'd expect to see swirls and edges in Arabic calligraphy, but the inscriptions themselves don't say anything. It's just swirls and edges. Balancing the legible with the illegible, the meaningful with the aesthetic, brings us back to that point I mentioned about appropriation versus acculturation. Yes, Pedro was friends with Muhammad and was influenced by the Nasrid Granada styles, but he was also just using swirly letter-like designs to mimic Arabic without actually writing in Arabic. Or conversely, these may have once been legible inscriptions but were worn away by time. This is made even stranger by the presence of actual Arabic inscriptions around the Palacio, some of which support the idea that the Palacio was built in sections, with the first section having been constructed by Alfonso XI. Inside the Palacio, we have the Salón de Aljibre. If you know your Spanish, yes, that does mean something like living room water reservoir, but that's not actually what it was. Antonio Almagro wrote that the Salón de Palacio was likely part lounge, part bathing room, but it's difficult to determine specifics because the Palacio underwent pretty drastic renovations when it was transformed into the Convent, with even more renovations happening throughout the late medieval and early modern periods. What we're most interested in is the architectural mudahar elements of the salon. In his investigation of the floor plan, Almagro hypothesized that there was an entrance to the bathing room from the gardens, a very Nasrid Islamic kind of floor plan that harkens back to the bathroom entrance built by al-Hakam II, next to the hall of Abd al-Rahman III in the Madinat al-Zarna. Now is a good time to mention the reason I'm only showing you the worst pictures I could possibly find of the interior is because interior photography of the Palacio isn't allowed because right now it's a covenant, so this is what we get. I am equally, if not more, annoyed than you are. So let's take this moment of annoyance together to transition to a portion of the Palacio we can actually show pictures of. The Patio Árabe is perhaps the best example of the Nasrid architectural style I mentioned before. We have horseshoe arches, murcarnas, honeycomb plastering, intricate foliage, and abstract mosaics, all of which are parts of the Nasrid Islamic style. But Patio Árabe and Andalusian patios more broadly are also heavily influenced from Roman atriums. With the columns and wide sheltered spaces, there's really a lot of overlap here. We have those polylobed arches too, which were quite popular with the Almohad dynasty as a way of even further beautifying the horseshoe arches. The patios and courtyards of the broader palacio are pretty typical of period Islamic architecture styles too. The sectioned rectangular courtyards can be seen in places like the aforementioned Madinat al-Zahra. They're Islamic in nature. The patio Arabe, like the Salon del Aljibre, blends together aspects of Gothic or Christian Spanish architecture with distinctly Islamic architecture. We can also see these really beautiful facades on the palacio that are done in the Sepka Motif style.
The Sepka Motif has interlacing arches and may have originated from the 10th century Great Mosque of Cordoba by Caliph al-Hakam II, and it's still used today by modern Moroccan architects. In this image of the Palacio facade, you can clearly see the Sepka motif around the outside in this beautiful, tessellating, leaf-like pattern. The Sepka stops at the tops of two windows, which are arched with these multifoil arches. And you can always tell a multifoil arch because it looks like someone took a bite out of a normal arch with like freakishly even teeth. On the same image, we have some very intricate capitals with little bits of curling leaves carved into them, and they resemble similar spolia capitals. On the middle capital, there are two curling scrolls with a rope-like or bead-like carving running between them, as well as underneath the bottom leaves. This middle capital is pretty similar to other Umayyad dynasty capitals in that they're both what we might call composite capitals, combining elements from earlier Greek and Roman columns with that of Islamic columns.
What's most interesting about this capital and the outer facade more broadly is that this was part of the palacio facing the outside. This isn't hidden like you might be able to describe the patios and the salons and the inscriptions, which means that Pedro was not only actively using Islamic architecture for his private spaces, he was using them for public ones. And that's a pretty big deal. It was a public declaration of his inclination towards the Islamic style and possibly Muslims more broadly. So, obviously, the 14th century Palacio demonstrates Convivencia, right? The Alcázar de Seville is perhaps one of the best-known Spanish architectural spaces and definitely the best-known example of Mudéjar-styled architecture. Like the Palacio de Tordesillas, the Alcázar blends together Islamic and Gothic styles into a beautiful and confusing display of cultural hybridity, if not explicitly appropriation or appreciation. The Alcázar was originally built in the 10th century during the Andalusi period of Spain, making the initial base structure Islamic in design. The Alcázar was then taken over in the 12th century by the Moroccan Muslim Almohad dynasty and was expanded and renovated in places such as the El Patio de Hierro and the Halls of Justice. Patios and jardins were typical of Islamic building styles, as it showed a connectedness to nature and an appreciation of Allah's creation. We can see this in many Islamic gardens. The Umayyad gardens at the Al Rufasa, for instance, which use a quadrilateral charbagh design in the garden. And that exact same kind of charbagh design features in the gardens of the Alcázar. In terms of stylism and the art historic, we can actually see the evolution of capital styles in the Alcázar. In the 10th century, the Caliph of Cordoba, Abd al-Rahman III, founded his own palace city, which I've mentioned before, the Madinat al-Zahra. And al-Rahman used so much freshly carved marble in the palace city's construction that he reopened the abandoned Roman marble quarries. The column capitals evolved from late antique Corinthian styles, but in typical Islamic fashion emphasized natural beauty, the abstract, and intricate decoration. These capitals and columns were also frequently inscribed with the name and titles of the caliph. When construction began, they reused old Umayyad capitals even as far away as Seville in the Alcázar. Some authors have suggested that the inscriptions on the original Madinat al-Zahra capital have survived to the Alcázar, which would suggest that we have Arabic inscriptions praising Islamic caliphs in the Christian Alcázar, but I couldn't find anything asterisk. Nevertheless, the capitals do tell us quite a bit about the nature of the Alcázar's cultural hybridity. As mentioned, the capitals were originally Islamic in nature, belonging in some cases to the Madinat al-Zahra palace. Would this not imply some form of appropriation and conquest? Sure, it obviously demonstrates resourcefulness and practicality. Why go through all the trouble of reopening those marble quarries and fashioning a bunch of fancy new capitals from scratch when you can just take ones that already exist? But it's more than that, right?
If we take a look at this picture, we can see some absolutely stunning examples of the stylistic elements I've just discussed. Those multifoil, bite mark looking arches are present, and they meet together at this joint with some Pseudo-Arabic calligraphy framing Sepka plasterwork. Already, between the arches and the Sepka, the image feels opulent, complex, and almost towering. The step-like tooth marks of the multifoil arches seem to step higher and higher by nature of their curves and edges. The detailed patterned plasterwork is situated in diamond shapes pointed upwards and also contributing to that feeling of height. The foliage detail on one diamond is identical to the others, giving a sense of pattern and, in turn, eternity. If we move on to the columns, we can see that they're slender and grouped like Roman Gothic fasces columns. It's a blend of Spanish Christian and Nasrid Islamic style here.
Now, the reason why I've just analyzed these two royal structures is that quite often in art history, both Spanish and English, there's a tendency to categorize cultural hybridity in art as evidence of perfect harmony and religious tolerance. Like, all interpretations are valid, but this one isn't. The reason that it isn't is because claiming some sort of wide sweeping convivencia based on a few structures diminishes the very real brutality, racism, religious intolerance, etc. that Muslim and Jewish communities faced. I mentioned the Siete Partidas earlier, and that's just one of the many examples of political oppression Muslim and Jewish people faced in medieval Spain.
I wouldn't classify either the Alcazar or the Palacio as forms of convivencia, architectural or otherwise. Yes, Pedro de Castile was good friends with Muhammad V of Granada and took on Islamic stylization, but religious harmony entails more than two rulers being allies or the blending of traditional art styles. I instead posit in my own work the idea of cultural intimacy, a slightly sexier term for what Fairchild Ruggles calls cultural hybridity. The presence of intimacy doesn't necessarily discount the potential for violence. After all, many things that are intimate can also be vulnerable or have the potential for danger. The very presence of laws regarding interreligious sex, for instance, suggests that people were interacting in intimate and tangible ways, which, alongside the public architectural cultural hybridity we've just discussed, goes counter to the idea of anti-convivencia. At the same time, stone carvings that appropriate styles of an oppressed minority community in Castile, as well as things like the Siete Partidas, disallows us to use the term convivencia to describe medieval Spain.
So, what can we say then about the nature of medieval Spain, tolerance or lack thereof, and Castilian architecture? That there was both great tolerance and great intolerance, great camaraderie and great peace, and great violence and great oppression. There was both acculturation and appropriation. History is rarely black and white. It's always shades of gray, right? And it's rarely as clear-cut as it seems, and this is just as true for Spain as it is for anywhere else. So to reduce these architectural and broadly artistic constructions as indicative of either perfect convivencia or perfect anti-convivencia is reductive.
Therefore, I conclude that the art and the history and the art history of the Palacio de Tordesillas and the Alcázar de Seville do not demonstrate convivencia nor anti-convivencia, but instead a sense of cultural intimacy, encompassing both acculturation and appropriation and situating Christians and Muslims in a complex and ever-changing relationship with one another.